start, because we've been joined by Dr. Kath MacFarlane. I've been reading through Dr. MacFarlane's resume and I feel exhausted. Busy woman. Now, Dr. MacFarlane holds a Bachelor of Arts Law from the University of Sydney and has a graduate diploma in legal practice from the College of Law in Sydney as well. And she recently completed her PhD in law at N.S.W, examining care criminalisation, the involvement of children in out-of-home care in the New South Wales criminal justice system. And as we know, there are way too many kids in that system. Dr. MacFarlane's also held a variety of policy and research roles in child welfare and criminal justice across bureaucracy, academia and politics. And Kath has worked as a consultant to the Department of Community Services longitudinal study of the outcomes of children in out-of-home care, and a member of the New South Wales Corrections Health Inmate Advisory Group and the New South Wales Department of Justice and Attorney General's Women's Advisory Council. In 2010, while teaching justice studies at Sturt Uni, Kath was the chief investigator for a government-awarded tender to examine bail practices affecting children and young people. From 2011 to 2015, Kath was the chief of staff to the New South Wales Minister, running the political office across various portfolios, including planning and infrastructure, juvenile justice, corrections, Attorney General, family and community services and social housing. And in 2016, Kath rejoined Sturt Uni as a senior lecturer in justice studies. I'm tired already. Wow. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Kath MacFarlane.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. They make it sound like that to impress the students at the university, so don't worry about that. So what we're going to talk about today are children in care and their involvement in the criminal justice system. And I'm going to be basing this research a little bit on my PhD findings, which were looking at kids in care, but particularly focusing on some research that's been done by some of my colleagues at Sturt University around talking to people from regional, mostly Western districts, out-of-home care providers, police, legal aid, ALS, Aboriginal Legal Service lawyers, and we're going to be talking to FACS staff and we're going to be talking to Children's Court magistrates. And what we were doing was focusing on out-of-home care and saying to workers across a whole variety of different professions, tell us what's happening, because we know what the research says and we know what the policy directions that you're probably all getting from up high are, but we don't know what it actually means for you on the ground, and we really need to know what it means for the kids. So we haven't interviewed children yet, and that might be something that comes down the track, although as I'm sure many of you can appreciate, that's got a bit of difficulties about asking them about these sorts of questions, but we hope to do that down the track. But for the meantime, I thought how I'll do it is I've got some slides here, a little bit of a history about kids in out-of-home care and the involvement with the justice system, in case people don't really know that part of it. Then I'll talk about what the research is that my colleagues and I undertook. And then I thought, if there's some questions, I'd really love it at any time. If anyone's got any questions or wants to make a point, if you think I'm outrageously wrong, I don't care. Please ask me, let me know. What's really important for me is that you guys are the ones, many of you actually deal with these issues every day, and many of you probably are out-of-home care workers, particularly in residential care. So there's a lot of information and knowledge that you've got that would really benefit me to learn about. So if you want to make a point or ask a question at any time, please just put your hand up and identify who you are so I know who I'm talking to, and we'll go from there. Otherwise, I'll open it up to questions at the end as well. Okay, so and you have to forgive me squinting. I left my glasses in the car and I'm pretending to be able to see, but we'll see how it goes. So this research was done by myself and my colleagues, Doctors Alison Gerard, Emma Colvin and Andrew McGrath. So they're lawyers, criminologists and social workers, psychologists. So a sort of multidiscipline, a lot of different perspectives. And they've had experience working either in the Children's Court or in juvenile justice, or just working, some of them were, a couple of them have worked with young people in residential care themselves. So a lot of different experiences. So if we start with the history, just very briefly, as many of you will be aware, the government's acknowledged some years ago now the impact of the widespread and systemic abuse of children in out-of-home care that was perpetrated by both state and non-government agencies over the past 200 years. And of course we've had the first apology, which was to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for the forced removal of their children. Then there was a second apology to child migrants who were transported from Britain and Malta. And then there were apologies for both the systemic abuse, so not just for individual children, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but for the systemic disadvantage. And the third apology was for 500,000 forgotten Australians. So people who were Australian children who grew up in state, church and private foster homes, orphanages and other institutions. That was meant to be the last of the apologies, but it was followed again by another one to 150,000 women and their families whose children were forcibly removed from them and adopted out against their will and without their consent. So as these 4 apologies in a very short period of time indicate, it was the government and the country coming to terms with the fact that it wasn't just a few isolated cases here and there of children that we'd let down and families that we'd fragmented, but it was pretty much nationwide and pretty much systemic throughout at least 100 years. So this reason why this is important is that this is the families and the tradition of the children that many of you are caring for now in out-of-home care. So as we're hearing now also from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, there's been some very harrowing and very horrible evidence that's been given, particularly from young women who are in Parramatta and Hay girls' homes. And they were incarcerated in what were detention centres, but those detention centres were run by the equivalent of FACS today, New South Wales Family and Community Services. They were child welfare homes, they weren't just juvenile justice detention centres. And the reason that that's important is that many of the girls were placed in those homes for things that they'd done which we wouldn't now consider a crime in any way. So they were exposed to moral danger, which meant they were victims of child abuse and at risk and at need of child protection services. Or they'd run away from abusive situations or run away from homes, and they were deemed uncontrollable. As the Royal Commission has recently heard, the abuses that were inflicted on these young women were state-sanctioned violence. In Hay in particular, and the Royal Commission will be making this finding shortly, rape was used as a deliberate tool to inflict terror and fear amongst the girls at Hay. And this is very horrible things to say, but it wasn't that long ago. It's only in the 60s and 70s that a lot of these abuses came to light. And the real problem, and what all of us are obviously committed to ensuring, is that the things that have been identified that happened previously aren't happening in our homes and services today. And if they are, we need to be doing everything we can to stop that. So we know that Australian child removal policies resulted in systemic and long-standing disadvantage for hundreds of thousands of people. The New South Wales government apology said that there were untold consequences and acknowledged that there was a legacy that had been passed down the generations from family to family. So that's another thing to remember with many of the families and the children that you're dealing with, is that many of them, it's intergenerational. And there was a exhibition, I'm not sure if any of you got to see it, it was at the National Museum of Australia down in Canberra, and then it travelled to a number of states, unfortunately not New South Wales. And that exhibition was what it was like growing up in an institution in Australia in the 20th century. And a lot of the exhibits from that exhibition were from people who had been in care themselves, so they were maybe the only letter that they had from a mother, or something that a carer had given them that they'd meant a lot to them, or report cards. But it was also more harrowing stories and testimony about the kinds of abuses that had happened to these kids in homes. And in this example, Katie Marie, who has written quite a lot about her experiences in homes, was disclosing that it was the 5th generation that had been in state care. So you get a lot of discussions, and I'm sure many of you have heard this, about whether you get parents that are just no good at parenting and just keep their kids going to care and then their kids going to care and so on. But what all of these apologies and history show is that it's not just the family that have a lot to learn about how to raise children, it's the state. And the state, the chances are, if you're in state care, the chances of you having your own children removed or your grandchildren removed are incredibly high compared to other people in the population. So again, this is something that, why is this happening and what can we do to prevent it? So we know that there's a whole lot of papers which have revealed that people in out-of-home care, and certainly not all of them, but many people experience significant disadvantages as adults. And you can read sort of the general list of things that I'm sure many of you encounter every day. But the thing of particular interest to me is the last one, the contact with the criminal justice system. So to have a quote here, he won't mind me putting it in, that's my husband, he was in care, so that's him standing there by a comment that he'd made at the museum. He's very proud of that, so I said, yeah, all right, I'll put your slide in. So what he's basically saying there is that institutional abuse, and this is something as workers that we have to be really careful about, and as family members you have to be on the watch for, and as children you hope never to have to experience. But institutional abuse doesn't happen, it doesn't just stop when you age out of the system at 16 or 18. So the figures are appalling. There's a 1 in 3 chance of leaving care at 16 as a girl who's pregnant or already has a child. 1 in 2 chance of being homeless within that first year, and only 1 in 100 is going to get to university. So when you're someone like me who's had a fairly privileged upbringing, I had an intact family, I didn't get taken into care, I got to go to university, I got to teach at university. So I was still the first one in my family to go to uni, so it's still kind of quite new to me. But to think that somebody has a greater chance if they're in care at going to jail than they do at coming to somewhere where I teach is an appalling thing, and that's still the figures today. So we also know that being a member or a descendant of the stolen generations or the forgotten Australians is associated with involvement in the criminal justice system. So there's been studies that have been done within jail populations, so looking at adults in jails, and we know that they have different mental and physical health needs than other prisoners. And that's despite the fact that if you're going to jail, you're generally disadvantaged in the first place. Otherwise, you'd be able to buy your way out with a good lawyer, or you wouldn't be caught up in the systems in the first place. So even with that level of disadvantage, care kids are still more likely to end up in jail and to have different issues. And if we talk just about the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody, they looked at 99 deaths, and almost half have been removed from their families as children. So this is the background of the families of the children and the children that you're providing assistance for. Something that made a huge impact to me, and I did some, I spent 3 years running a pro bono legal service in jail, in Long Bay Remand Centre, and then in Women's Maximum Security Mullawa Women's Jail. And that was quite an experience. It was very, very interesting. But a lot of, and where my interest in all of this came from, was that a lot of the guys and the women were saying, the guys would tell you they were in care. The women wouldn't. They'd be worried about their children, and they'd talk about their children being in care. But through that, the kind of conversations they were saying was, I don't want my kid to go through what I went through. You know, I went straight from Parramatta Girls' Home, I went to Hay, I went to Mullawa Jail, which is now Silverwater Women's, and you know it's the same places. But with the men, what was really interesting is I had a look at files for what they call the never to be released, so the worst crimes that you can imagine, the worst of the worst, and many of them had been in boys' homes and institutions. So if we just give an example, and this is research which prisoners themselves did and then was verified by other people. If you look at the ones who went through Tamworth Boys' Home in the 60s and 70s, 35 violent deaths have been associated with those men, and 15 men currently serving life sentences for some of the worst crimes in Australian history. So you might say, well, they were bad kids, they were never going to do any good, it's no wonder. That, I think, is a really short-sighted way of looking at it, because what's really horrible but important to know is that many of their kids didn't have criminal records when they went into Tamworth Boys' Home. They'd run away from care. So they were put in, or they'd had like minor theft, stealing, fairly small stuff. But what happened to them is that you get people like Nettie Smith. I'm sure many of you have heard of Nettie Smith. 8 murders charged with, convicted of 2. James Finch might not be a name that's familiar with you, but he was known for the Whiskey A Go-Go fire, which killed 15 people. It was Australia's worst mass murder at that time. Archibald Rafferty killed 3 men at random, later killed another one in prison, thinking that his little son had told him to kill 7 people. They were all care kids. George Freeman, very suave. I think he called himself the Sydney crime czar. That's not my comments, but alleged, because he was never actually convicted for that. But then also Billy Mundy, and somebody that I represented at a parole hearing, I'm a lawyer as well, a parole hearing, Peter Schneiders, who was then Australia's longest serving prisoner. He'd done 21 years straight in jail after starting out, going in originally for defrauding checks. He was brutalised through the Grafton prison system, where they used to bash them on reception and do all sorts of things, and he ended up killing a prison guard and was in solitary confinement for years. So all of these guys, and the reason I'm choosing these particular ones is that they've actually written stuff about the prison system and about the child welfare home. A lot of the people that you deal with don't talk about it, they won't write about it, you don't know their backgrounds. These guys all wrote about it, and what they all had in common was they said it was the welfare home that was worse than jail. So we obviously hope that things have changed a great deal and that we don't have this situation. But unfortunately, what we know is that while many of the children today in society generally don't commit crimes, and that's clear, you might think, oh, you know, bloody kids rampaging around doing crime waves, but really the overwhelming bulk of evidence is that most children don't ever commit an offence. And of those that do, it's low scale and it's one-off and they stop. It's an unusual young person who gets involved and keeps offending. But if you're in out-of-home care, it is associated and has been independently associated, not just with offending once, but with reoffending. We also know that if you're a care kid, you're more likely to get a caution or a conviction than another child. You're more likely to start offending early and to offend often and offend over a long period of time. And they're disproportionately represented in serious and violent offending. This is today. They're more likely to be in custody as well. And this is on remand, not necessarily that there's kids who've, you know, gone and killed somebody and got convicted. We're not talking about those kind of kids. We're talking about people who've been charged for relatively minor offences often, but they're more likely to get bail refused and to go into custody. So if we just look at Aboriginal boys that are in custody, in 2008, that's the latest, unfortunately, the latest figures, 62% of the Aboriginal kids, boys in custody had been or were in care. This is now. And it's still bad for other children as well. So 19% of non-Aboriginal females and 36% of the non-Aboriginal boys who had a history of care in the jail system. But particularly if you're Aboriginal, particularly if you're a young man and you're in care, this is not looking not good. The reason that that's also important is compared to other kids in custody, there are big differences between the mental health issues. And again, we could talk about or look at, do they have mental health issues, which is why they get involved in custody, and that certainly is a pathway for many young people. But are there other things that, despite the disadvantage, because many of the young people in custody also have serious mental health issues, they also have a recidivism, so they're more likely to be in jail for long periods of time or more often than once. But what we find is care kids again are different. So they're worse health outcomes, they're more likely to be jailed more than 5 times, they're more likely to have been victims of child sexual assault, and they are unfortunately more likely to have attempted suicide. So these are all very depressing figures, and I apologise for that, but I'm trying to give you a little bit of an understanding of why this actually matters. And the most important thing is with those figures of, for example, 62% of the Aboriginal kids in custody being from care, is that the care population's tiny. If we have the opportunity to do something to address the criminalisation and the offending of young people in care, you can make a huge difference in terms of crimes in society and a huge difference in jail numbers. But it's a very, very small group. They only make up between 0.2 and 0.5% of all kids in New South Wales across Australia. It's a small group. So what we were looking at Charles Sturt University is that we knew all of these figures, we knew the situation, but we wanted to know, well, what do people like yourselves know about it? What are you doing about it? Does anyone talk to you about this? What can we learn? So we interviewed a number of frontline workers, 41 frontline workers. It's a small survey, there's probably about 41 or so of you in the room, but in terms of Australian research, it's actually quite large. They don't do big-scale research in New South Wales or in Australia yet. We would love to have everybody have their views and tell us what it's all like, but it's really unusual. So 41's not too bad a size. And that included police from very junior levels all the way through to senior, non-government out-of-home care providers, so many organisations that you might be represented here today. We spoke to them. We spoke to JJ workers, so people that are actually in detention centres looking after the children. And, we spoke to legal aid, Aboriginal Legal Service and children's care lawyers. 3/4 of them were from regional New South Wales, so the campus is based in Bathurst. We thought that it would be different in regional centres, and we wanted to know what the difference was compared to the city. So 3/4 were from regional New South Wales and 1/4 were from Metro, mainly Sydney West. And we're going to be talking to FACS staff and to New South Wales Children's Magistrates as well shortly to complete that survey. We focused on residential care. So there's a lot of information that's needed to be known about foster care, but residential care seems to be the most problematic at the moment, and there's a huge variety of reasons for that, some of which people told us about. The other thing about residential care, which you also may know as group home care, depending on what terminology you use. Residential used to be the big old institutions of 30, 40 kids. Now we're talking group homes where they're conducted mainly by private service providers at FACS contracts, and you've got between 2 to 6 kids in them, depending. So the reason we wanted to focus on them is that there's been a huge increase in the number of residential group homes in recent years in New South Wales, and particularly over the mountains. So 5 years ago or so, there weren't very many service providers that were providing it. It was mostly Docs FACS run, and there weren't really many around Orange or Bathurst. People they didn't really exist. Now, in an explosion, there are relatively quite a number. So we were like, well, something changed, what's going on? So this is a quote from a juvenile justice officer who's just describing the group home. So, basically saying it runs like a normal house with, you got chores. And that's their version of what it was like. We heard a few other things from residential care providers and other people about what the share houses were like. So residential staff, very basically, the kind of things they told us, and this was really, really interesting, is that everyone said residential care is not good. So these are workers that are hired, contracted, this is their job, and they said to us, you don't want the kids in here. That was really surprising to us because we thought it's natural that you'd defend your job or you'd think you're doing a good job. They didn't. They said they didn't have enough training. Everyone always says that, and it appears that that's always the case. There's just so people are so busy doing the job they don't necessarily get the training they need before they start it or along the way. And that's hugely problematic when you're dealing with a very needy group of young people who may have mental health, physical health and other problems to deal with. They said they didn't know how to handle the kids, which was something we found surprising as well. We think people were being very honest, and we appreciated that. They said they were frustrated and angry, but they also felt, unsurprisingly, that they're doing the best they could. So they were quite judgmental about themselves. They weren't really judging each other, but they're saying, look, we're not trained properly, we're not paid properly. We know that residential care doesn't work for the fact that they put, a 12-year-old in with a 17-year-old, and one might be an offender and one might not, and one's Aboriginal and one isn't, one girl, one a boy, and they expect them to get on. No 12-year-old and 17-year-old get on without fighting. What do they expect to happen in this situation? Multiply that by how many kids you got. So that's the kind of things they were saying. But they did feel they were doing what they could. But it was a very different perspective from the police and from legal aid and from other workers as well. What they told us were things which the residential care workers had also told us, that basically there's not much pay, the turnover rates are very high, and that is both through career progression, so not that many people, you have to be a particular kind of person to think that residential care is the height of your career. A lot of people like the work, but they want to do something else. Not that many people want to be a resi care worker, and I think it shows a great deal of dedication if that's what people do want to do. A lot of people also, a lot of police and the like, also thought it was a really entry-level position. So we're not sure whether they were undermining the workers, not giving them the respect that they should have, or whether they were just constantly encountering very junior staff on shifts when problems were arising. We're trying to explore that a bit more. Again, they agreed that the staff don't necessarily have the skills and the training that they need to deal with the children. And also everyone raised that the children have mental health and other issues that don't get properly addressed. One of the big issues that came across very clearly was that workers in residential care units relied on the police a lot. The police didn't like this, the residential care workers didn't like it, the kids obviously hate it, and it didn't lead to good outcomes. But what was really interesting was that a lot of people told us that workers relied on police to teach the kids a lesson. So the kid would do something the worker would respond, the child would react usually with anger and bad language and maybe with violence. The worker would be like, I don't know what to do, I'll call the cops. The police, therefore, then had a really interesting situation because they're saying, well, we're the police. We're not social workers. We don't know how to sit down and be nice to children. That's what you guys do. We arrest them. We're good at it. We want to arrest them because we're good at it. And so there was this total disconnection all the time because the workers would think the police would come and give the kids a good talking to and, you do that again and, you're going off to jail. The cops wouldn't. They wouldn't give them the talking to. They'd just arrest them. So the workers were going, whoa, no, that's not what we wanted. And the police were saying, well, what do you expect? So it's a real disconnection between those two professions in particular. We also had police who were saying, look, we have to protect workers and other children when a young person is acting out or is violent. And certainly there are instances, and maybe some of you have encountered those, where children are difficult to manage and they are a risk to staff or to other young people. And in those circumstances, what the police did is they gave them an AVO. The problem with giving an AVO to a young person, particularly if they have a mental health issue or an intellectual disability, is that they breach them. They don't know or they don't care what they mean, and they breach them. The police would then, in their little notebooks and on their data systems, would have identified that this child was a breacher and a criminal. They don't distinguish in the police database between a child who has massive mental health issues and therefore is coming to their attention, or someone who's coming to their attention because they're, doing armed robberies every night. There's no distinction. They just call it up and it looks, child that's had 20 interactions with the police. So that's a real problem, I think, and that very much the police need to work on how they identify those young people. So then what happened, we also found that was really surprising, is that you'd have police that were really new to the job. Many of the people we spoke to said the cops that came out are first day on the job. So they've just graduated, they don't have a clue, and they're gung-ho and they're all like so keen. And they're going to go sort out these kids at the group home. Not a clue. And the kids would know that. Maybe the senior police hierarchy thought it would be better to have young people that the children could relate to more, but that appeared to be a real problem, and many of the older police were extremely concerned about young police overreacting and not having the skills to deal with the children, particularly when police training on mental health is very poor, as I'm sure many of you would know. They don't have experience in dealing with people with mental health issues until they're on the street, let alone a house of children where they've been called in because the workers can't settle them down. So that was really problematic. The kind of offences we were looking for, we said to the workers and to the police and to legal aid, we said, what are the kids doing? Is it murder, armed robbery, rape? Should we be afraid? Should we be implementing more restrictive practices? And they're like, no. It's very, very minor offences. The kind of things they're doing is that they're swearing at people. They're smashing things. They're breaking property. They're stealing. Then as we escalate it, they steal workers' cars and go for joyrides. I'm not sure if anyone... Usually when I do this, someone goes, no. Someone's had that happen to them. But that sort of thing happens. And that, of course, is incredibly dangerous because many of the kids either don't know how to drive or they go off and they smash the car. So you have quite a high-risk activity in workers' cars getting stolen. But more likely what they're doing is more minor-level sort of stuff and smashing the place up. Now, that's not to say that's not terrifying to a worker, especially a young and experienced worker, especially someone that's on shift on their own. Of course it's terrifying, and again, that's when cops would get called in. What we found also, though, is that kids in care, though, were treated differently. That's all right, we can talk over it, or that's all good. There you go, it stopped. So kids in care were treated differently for committing the same sorts of offences than kids in a so-called normal family. So what you found in a so-called normal family is that, if you swore at your parents or you broke your sister's jewellery box or something, you get grounded, you get slapped, you get punished in some way, they take your pocket money, a whole variety of things. But in care, almost the first reaction was to call the police. And this escalated children for relatively minor things really quickly up the scale. And if that was happening sometimes on a daily, weekly basis, the police would know who those individual kids are, and there's no flexibility at all, no tolerance. So those kids are fast-tracked into the court system. So if we give an example here, carers, this is an example that was given by a legal aid lawyer of a case, and this was taken from the police fact sheet. So essentially what happened is the carer goes to get a young girl out of bed, and she's sworn at them. So she's like, F off, I'm not getting out of bed, something like that. And they say, get out of bed or we're going to pour water on you. Okay, so she doesn't get out of bed. So then they went and got water and they poured it on her. So unsurprisingly, because I think I would have the same reaction if cold water was poured on me at early in the morning, she gets out of bed, she's stamping around, she's swearing. And apparently what they also did is they went to the kitchen, they got saucepans and they started smashing the saucepans to wake her up, get her out of bed. So far I wouldn't think that's a perfect match between child reaction and carer behaviour. But she's going off. So they say if she doesn't stop swearing and calm down, they're going to take all the posters off the wall as a punishment. She doesn't calm down. They take the posters off the wall. She goes ballistic and starts punching out. They call the police. So before 9 o'clock, as this lawyer's saying, it's before 9 o'clock in the morning, she's in custody, she's going to a police station, she's going to go to court, and it's all over something really minor first thing in the morning. Now, I know children have to get up and have to go to school, but this seems to be an unreasonable way to get someone to get up and get them to do what you want. Also, what's interesting is the whole taking the posters off the wall is also what the Corrections Department did post-Nagel Royal Commission when they were under Yabsley, when they were trying to tighten up in the prison system. They took the posters off the wall and the jails rioted. So there is a precedent for leave people's personal possessions alone because they tend not to want you touching them. So the word that kept cropping up all the time when we're talking to workers was escalation. So people were saying kids in care are treated differently and their offences, if they are offences, are escalated. Everybody kept talking about escalation. So it's things like malicious damage, common assault, offensive behaviour. They've acted out. There's a decision that they're not happy with, and that is obviously going to happen a lot. And there's potentially aggressive behaviour. They kick a wall, broke a TV. The staff lock themselves in a room to remove themselves from the client, in this case, from the threat, and you can understand that behaviour, but they call the police, and then, again, we had this escalation. And we were hearing, these are just a couple of quotes, but we were hearing these sorts of stories over and over and over. Another thing, and this is a real problem that we're looking into more, is running from care. Now, the police in particular were incredibly frustrated by what residential care home workers were doing when children ran away. So the police have a slightly different perspective. I don't totally agree with this. What the police were saying is, if you report a child as missing, they have to go look for them. But they're saying, well, they're not missing. They've just gone off to the mall somewhere, or they've gone off with their friends. The workers know where they are. They're calling them. But they just, bug it off and they're not coming home. So they will come home eventually. Why do we have to, as police, have to look for them? The care workers are saying, well, hang on, the kid's missing. I have to report it. We don't know what they're exposed to or what they're at risk or what they're doing, and I'm worried about it. So you had, again, a real disconnection between what the police thought would happen. And they can't arrest a kid for running away because now it's not a crime. It used to be. You used to be able to be charged for running from care. You can get arrested for it and sort of put in protective custody and locked up still if you do run and keep running, but you can't get charged like you used to. So the cops are kind of, is it old days or new days? They know what to do. The workers are saying, well, they might be fine. I'm going to cover my back though because we have to, but also they may be getting up to no good and committing criminal offences. But unfortunately, what the research also shows, and this is where I personally disagree with the police, is that these kids are incredibly at risk. So if you've got a kid that's run away from care and they're out on the streets or with older kids or other people, they are victimised, they're preyed upon. It's where a lot of the sexual exploitation happens. So inquiries into England in Rotherham, I'm not sure if you heard of the Rotherham inquiry, but it was only a year or two ago, and it led to the forced resignation of the Commissioner of Police equivalent and a whole lot of others, because they weren't doing anything when kids were reported as missing. And all these kids were actually caught up in a organised pedophile sex trafficking network. And we're talking not just care kids, but in all there were like 1,400 children from one little area over a 10-year period that were caught up in this system. And a lot of it happened because they stopped caring about the care kids that ran away, and they stopped following where they were going, and they stopped chasing them, and they stopped trying to work out what was happening, and it just steamrolled from there. So I'm a bit more cautious than the cops are on that one, I think. But it led to a lot of drama and a lot of trouble between care workers and police. One of the big things the police were complaining about a lot was that the children had come back, almost always they come back, and almost always they come back pretty soon, 24 hours, 48 hours, but then the workers wouldn't tell the police. So the police are still out there scouting and looking for them, and then they see them. So the kid's been home for 2 days or so. The police see them like, aha, we have found this child, and they go and try and drag them home, and the kid starts yelling their head off and screaming at them, and then they get done for resist arrest, offensive behaviour. So a lot of arrests happened at that point with the cops standing there going, I'm just trying to take you home. So that was really problematic. The extent of the problem can be indicated by, in one area, one command only in Western Sydney, they had 900 missing kid reports in just 2 years from care homes. So that is tiny. That could represent, we think that represents no more than 20 young people in that whole time. 900 missing reports. So you can understand why the police are going, what do you expect us to do? But equally, you can understand the risk that is posed to these young children if they're not stopped from running or if they're not dealt with in some way. And of course, another thing which people weren't really talking about in our research, but which is worth considering, is that often young people run away for a very good reason. They're running from abuse, they're running from an untenable living situation, or they're running because they quite naturally want to be back with their real family or their last carers or something. We might not like it, and it might be incredibly dangerous for them to do that, but that's what they're going to do. So we have a strange situation where natural child behaviour is punished. Ultimately, the worst thing that can happen, other than the child being put at risk, the worst thing that can happen is that they end up getting locked up. And there's a couple of girls, maybe 6 at any one time, who are in preventative detention essentially because they won't stop running. And so they haven't done anything wrong other than go missing from care. So that's something that was quite problematic. What we have found as well is that children were often bail refused, or they had really onerous conditions put on them. So there'd be things like, you must report 3 times a day, 5 days a week. The kid's like, yeah, right. So they wouldn't do it, they'd breach. Or you must not go near such and such an address. We know your mum lives there, and we know your grandmother lives there, and your sister's there, and everyone goes around there after lunch, after school. But you're not allowed to go there. No kid is going to abide by that. They don't understand the consequences and they don't understand the conditions. So they go there, they get breached. Well, also, police aren't stupid. So they realised a lot of offending, minor level offending, is happening in care homes. So they over-police them. So that means that care kids, if they're identified and known to be care kids, are subject to a lot more surveillance than other kids necessarily are. And in small towns, particularly in regional areas, you know who the half a dozen kids are that are in care pretty soon. And if they are involved in offending, then this just escalates. So what happened is that these kids would then be spend more time in detention, and particularly if the group home that's charged them wants to teach them a lesson, particularly we found if workers had been threatened, they'd be like, let them spend a night or 2 in jail. And what happened is that the kids would come to court, no one would come to court to support them or to assist them. They'd get bail, they'd breach it, they'd get arrested, they'd go back to jail over and over and over. When not part of our research, but when I was working in the children's court some years ago, there was a young woman who was about 16 years of age who every Friday the magistrate would clear an hour of his court time because he knew she'd be coming in every single Friday. She'd get picked up. And it was just, not quite sure why, but it was just always the same time, the same home, keep bringing them back, same conditions, off she'd go. She'd breach again, come back again. 12 months. Every week for 12 months this girl just kept reappearing, and it was like surely an exercise in futility. Something's not working. So that's essentially what we found. So we then had a quick look at what's needed. So the kind of things about what's needed, it's, I'm an academic, sorry, but like research and data. We want to know more about what's happening. How many kids is this affecting? What are we going to do about it? So in the UK, care status is accepted and known to be an indicator of risk. Not of risk of offending, of risk of harm. So they know that if you're in care, you're more likely to be vulnerable and have problems in custody. And therefore what they do is it's essentially triggers, as soon as you're in care, it triggers a whole lot of things to take place in custody. Basically a social worker to come and visit you, make sure you've got somewhere to go, make sure all of these things you need kick in. This is on paper, not necessarily in practice. There's a whole of government policy to reduce offending rates in the UK because they found that children in care were 11 times more likely to get arrested than another kid for the same kind of offence. So they said, this is ridiculous, it's costing us a fortune and it's not fair. So they tried to reduce the disparity. They got it down to 3 times, it's creeping back up to 5. So in the UK, a care kid's 5 times more likely now, but it's better than it was. So agencies, especially juvenile justice and corrective services, I think need to collect those figures because in the absence of information, how can you do anything? And then there's lots of other things, like we were talked about to people about the idea that children in care and people who've been through care who are now adults need a legal service staffed by people who understand what the particular legal issues are, in the same way that there's an Aboriginal legal service because of the particular issues affecting Aboriginal people. So it's a similar argument. And that also that there be many people who've been through care are terrified of going into aged care because the aged care homes are run by the same agencies that ran the juvenile homes where they were as kids. And it's okay for someone like me to go, well, I'm sure those places have changed. But if you were a child in care back in the 60s in a home run by somebody that was abusive, and now you're an older person looking at going into care, I can definitely understand the terror that that would involve. So I guess the question many of you are asking, this is where I'd really, really love your input, is, well, what can I do? And one of the big things when I talk about this issue is that many people just get overwhelmed. It's like it's all too big, it's all too horrible and it's too hard. Yes, it is. But there are things that people can do, particularly if they work in or with young people. So one of the things is just be aware that children or their parents may be terrified of your services, not of you, because they don't know you, but there's such a long history of involvement, and obviously many Aboriginal people would know what I'm talking about, is terrified of the welfare. It's the same for care. Generation after generation being removed, it has an impact, and there's that people know and they remember. So you have to, as a service, heal that yourself. You can't expect it to be on the child or their family to do that. You have to earn the trust of the family and the child. The other thing is what people were saying to us when we say, well, what would you say if you're telling someone that's in there, if we said to you, well, how would you do your job? The kind of things people were saying to us is, know the kids in your care. So try and know who they are. If they turn up because Fax has placed them in a resi care and they turn up and they've got, a singlet and one piece of paper, well, demand to know more about their background and who they are and what they need and their connections, because they might not be able to do that. You've got to do that for them. The main things people were saying is develop other ways of managing behaviour, and please don't rely on the police all the time to teach the kids a lesson. And the other thing that was really important is a number of agencies have got together and worked on some protocols, either with police or with each other, about how to respond to certain types of behaviour. And that's really important, is to look out there at who else is doing this kind of work and just see, have they got something that we can learn from? Or likewise, have I done something that another agency might benefit from? So they're the kind of things that we learnt. And what I'd like to know is, if there's any questions or comments or anything that you think I should know. Yeah.
Just at the beginning there, when you were saying about you interviewed people to try and find the answers and everything, I noticed there was no Aboriginal organisations or...
Oh, there were, it's interesting, there were, we interviewed the ALS, Aboriginal Legal Service. We put in a request for ABSEC for their workers and carers, and hopefully that'll be happening as well. There were Aboriginal workers within some of the organisations and some of the non-government...
It wasn't
yeah, I should make that more clear. Yeah, there were Aboriginal workers and organisations within the homes that were interviewed, definitely.
And also, we've just started up in Orange, and I know it's running in other places in New South Wales. The out-of-home care advisory group. So that's when children are going into care. As an Aboriginal community, there's a handful of us that get together. So when the child goes into care, the families that they're in care with can come and get information on us, or the children can come to us for issues and everything like that.
That's great.
As we have leaders in the town that will direct them to sporting or craft or anything, women's groups, men's groups and things like that.
How long's that been going? You're setting it up now?
We're just setting that up now.
Great.
We're just doing working with children checks and everything like that on the advisory group itself. And then we have the teddy bear system, which I'm starting that up, and that's for the children to have a bear when they're going to home care, and on that bear will be a photo and a person that will have a connection. So if it was my photo on that bear, that child could then come to me for any advice they needed, you know, cultural, spiritual, or anything like that. So that's going to be something that's going to be.
No, thank you. That's really helpful to know.
Like we've always said, you know, it takes a community to bring a child up. So, and that's what we're doing as a community.
Well, I think that's great, and certainly one of the big things is the lack of
through the Aboriginal women's group and the men's
through the women's group. Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
One here, and then we'll come to you.
Yeah. I'm team leader for Brighter Futures in Bathurst and part of Orange. What I've noticed the more we're moving into ROSH, which is probably very similar to the criminal justice system, is the child protection system also has a lot of people that we're identifying very early on that have been in out-of-home care services themselves and getting to that crisis point. And I think there's very much a similarity of the numbers there. So I would be just pulling figures out of the top of my head, but I'd be thinking it'd be probably about 30% of the clients that the referrals that we're getting through now have that history as a child. They're coming through into the system.
Right.
So I think there's over-representation there as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. Thanks.
Well, my question wasn't wondering if you did a bit of research. We have a lot of facts involve families that the kids go into like kin care or under a family arrangement as such. So they go to nans and aunties and so there hasn't been a court system as such. It's just sort of a family arrangement for the
It's interesting. There's much research that needs to be done in kinship care in the crime area, in the crossover as well, both as the protective factor, so maybe staying with family helps keep you out of involvement. But one of the problems as well is that often problems are intergenerational, and placing a child with family may actually be a short-sighted thing to do. And obviously facts and the agencies do all their checks and the like. But because of, particularly around the stolen generations and particularly the Aboriginal placement principles, there's been such a sensitivity around trying to make sure they get that right, that research into possible negative effects hasn't really been done. So there isn't much in New South Wales around kinship care and crime overlap. There should be, there needs to be, because if it's either protective, then we should be doing more of it, and if not, then we need to put those checks in to keep those kids safe as well.
Well, the kin carers and the nans aren't, like, there's not much support in place.
Oh, there's definitely, and the research does show kin care is less supported than other foster carers, particularly Aboriginal kinship care is less supported. So there's all of those issues that are important and then will shape what happened. In my PhD research, most of the kids I dealt with, I was looking at court records and just seeing how many kids, I'd get like a whole pile of court records and see who was in care and who wasn't, and then what type of care. And unfortunately, kin care and foster care were still up there in terms of getting involved in the justice system. So often it was that they'd offend with their cousins or their brother or someone like that, so they all sort of get roped into it. But definitely more research needs to be done. This just focused on residential care because of the growth of the resi care places, but we need to know what else is happening, strengths and weaknesses of those other forms of care as well.
I think with that, we have in rural remote towns, we have an Aboriginal home care program which supports carers and the kids in care. And we've found that being remote, it's a lack of support networks for those families and the number of children placed into those families.
Yeah.
So you might have 8 kids put into grandma, and grandma's on her own doing the best she can, and Then you've got kids with high trauma rates, and as they turn into teenagers, we all know where that escalates. And then we don't have access to child psychologists, and I mean, we're transporting carers at the moment with their kids to carer to get to child psychologists to try and get support around these kids.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I think it's not just, I agree that the kinship care, I'm very powerful with that, and I think it's a great place, but I think it's a lack of support that's put around the families, and the need for more higher needs support with those kids in particular.
Yep.
And lack of transport. Once you get out to our regional areas, there's nothing.
It's also interesting, I think, given, talking about Bathurst, which is where Charles Sturt campus is that I'm at, is that you've got Bathurst Jail, you've got Oberon Jail, you've got Kirkconnell, you've got all these various other ones, and the interaction of the children of prisoners and the lack of support, the Shine and various organisations that have been created around there. But you've also got those children of those prisoners who may be in care because of that overlap, and yet the lack
and
of...
still have to see their
Exactly.
father or their mother that's in jail that's created the trauma that's affected the child anyway.
Yeah, and they may want to, because
Yeah,
kids desperately want to see their parents off, in almost all circumstances, regardless of the level of abuse or neglect. That's the problem. Kids are kids. They want to go with their family. So it's that lack of support services around that to help people transport to the jail, or to help carers or residential care deal with the aftermath of seeing the parent in custody. I find that in an area that's sort of jail heavy, you think we'd kind of get it a bit right in Bathurst, but I don't think we've quite got there yet.
Just the girl that kept going back to court every 12 months, and she was just running away. She wasn't doing anything.
No, she had a mental illness, so she'd run away, she'd go down to the Blacktown Mall, she'd hang out, and then the cops would turn up and she'd just let rip. So she'd just yell at the cops all the time, and they'd just be like, yeah, right, yeah, so-and-so, and then they'd...
Was it almost the same judge?
Yeah, at that stage, the Children's Court operated a system whereby all the criminal matters were heard by this is Parramatta Court, were all heard by the court list was done by the one magistrate. So he knew her, and he would just be like, right, here she is, and he'd give her section 32, like the mental health, section 32, I think so, no conviction recorded on the basis of mental illness 52 times a year, because that's
I was wondering if she had a connection. Did she feel as though she had a connection with that judge because he spoke to her in a kind way?
Yeah.
Did it
No, I don't think she was running back for him. She basically just liked Blacktown Mall, and that was just her role in life, was to yell at the police when they came and picked her up, which rather than them leaving her there, because she wasn't doing anything at that point, perhaps she may have, and it may have escalated, she may have taken her anger out on someone else. But what I saw of it was just everyone just had their routine. And her routine was to go there, and their routine was to tell her to get home, and she'd yell at them, and they'd pick her up, and off we go.
I'm relatively new to the region, and you mentioned in the beginning about the explosion of residential care on the other side of the mountain. Did your research highlight any perhaps reasons why? Is it lack of...
We're looking more into that. I think the people who we were talking to didn't know. They weren't high enough connected to understand the policy that they're not getting told. But maybe they were just more aware of it. And we're just trying to determine whether that is actually the case. Certainly the police were like, there were no care homes here 5 years ago. I'm like, really? I'm not entirely sure about that. So I'm waiting on facts to confirm where they were so that we can just absolutely know that's the case. But they said, it's partly to do with the removal of responsibility from FACS providing out-of-home care services to the non-government sector. So there were always, Barnardo's and Burnside and places like that, but now the bigger agencies, many of you may be from, Lifestyle Solutions, Life Without Barriers, Marist Youth, Guardian Services, blah, 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 all of them, that didn't exist 10 years ago. So there's been a huge growth in a number of private or not-profit agencies moving into this area, and some of them have identified that you need to have regional services, and so they've said, here's a market, we'll go here. So there's that. It might also be that, I'm not really sure, but FACS may have changed some of its policies around that. They tell me that they always had some regional homes, but the focus used to be on foster care wherever possible, and I think there's been a bit of a pullback from that.
Yeah, I mean, I come from Broken Hill, so
Right.
they're way away, and we don't have any of that model, and we have a relatively small number of carers and that at the moment, but a large number of children, and a big part of my role is to recruit new carers and that sort of thing.
Very much foster carers you're
Yeah,
focusing? Oh,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
okay.
But yet, I mean, we already have significantly high numbers of young people that are in the juvenile justice system, you know, already. So, you know, I guess I'm just always thinking about different models or approaches and things, but as to what would really be the most appropriate.
Well, the group home care, and I realise we're running out of time, so I just finished off with this, but the group home care model came into place because foster carers weren't wanting to sign up, and the sheer explosion in the number of kids getting taken into care, and kids staying longer as well. So basically you had older kids who may not be suited for a family environment, or who don't want a family environment because of the abuse they've suffered, or groups of siblings. Now, you all know this. So group homes came about. They couldn't put big residential homes because all of the exposure about the abuses and just the institutional consequences for kids was so bad. So even though we have huge numbers of kids now, no one's saying, hey, let's have 15, 20, 30 kids in a home anymore. That's not happening at the moment. So Australia actually had the fastest deinstitutionalisation. It went from there's only like 3% of kids are in bigger homes, resi care homes now, across the Western world. So foster care was relied on. Foster care and kinship care, for various reasons, it can't always work, and there's not always people wanting to take those kids. So you have to have something, and that's where the group home came into focus. But it's now unfortunately been around long enough that the research is starting to come out that this isn't the answer either, and that unless you have properly trained, properly supported staff who see career advancement, who see it as a badge of honour to be a residential care worker, and who can move in those directions, and it's a thing to be supported, and unless they have the assistance that they need through other services, then residential care is equally as bad a model as some of the others that we've tried before.
So 24-hour care is a lot of burnout, there's, you know, a lot of changeover in staff because of that.
And there's also, I mean, Victoria just recently announced in the last couple of weeks that they were going to make it a requirement for residential care workers to have a degree, or a diploma, never been a requirement before. England just published less than a month ago reports saying that despite all of the inquiries that they've had, people were still going to be in charge of highly traumatised, high-need children, and the last job they'd had was Macca's. So they're getting casuals, you know, to fill in. And that is a recipe for disaster that history shows us is not good for the system, and it's certainly not good for the kids.
So they get the job and then they're in training.
Well, they're in training, yeah.
Well, thank you too, because that even motivates me more to find a lot more individual carers.
Individual care, hopefully that's the way to go.
Well, it's a big task being new to a small town as well, and then trying to get people to come forward. But
I think this is a good forum. There's a lot of local people around that might be able to help you out with that.
We've got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
I just had a quick question.
Sure.
In part of your research, did it take into account whether kids were having contact with their parents?
We didn't know. What we were asking carers and police and the like was what their perceptions were, what their views were of what the kids were doing and what they weren't. Some of the, it wasn't a question we particularly asked, mainly because that changes so often, and we didn't want to talk about individual children, so them saying, you know, Joe Blow's had this time. And so we were asking more generic. But what did come out of it was you often get the view that if a child has contact with the parent, that child then acts out and has consequences and doesn't want that contact. And so from a carer perspective, it's tempting to think the child ought not have the contact. From the other side, though, if the child then is running away because they've got no contact, you're going to have to deal with it anyway. And there's other people who would swear blindly that continued and constant contact with a family, almost regardless of how abusive the family has been in the past, is in the benefit of the child. There's such a wide spectrum depending on the circumstances. So we didn't really go into that.
It's how that is done as well.
Exactly. How it is done and what the reasons are for that child being removed.
But also the contract, how the contract is
Very
done.
much, yeah.
Most kids would say, a lot of kids would say, we knew we should be in care,
Yeah.
but we still needed to see
Yeah.
And if that's taken away from them, if that option is taken away from them, they can build up huge resentment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it may well fuel much of this, but we haven't unpicked that part yet. I think that we might get if we get to talk to the kids as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. MacFarlane. Total appreciation from the organising committee.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank all of you for your time. I really appreciate the chance to get to test it out and see what you think. Thank you.
I guess again, there's the optional